You're listening to Make Planning Make Sense. My name is Aaron Zimmerman, and I'm a director at Centro Planning Consultancy.
And my name is Alex Roth, a planner at Centro, and we'll be your hosts. Welcome back. In today's episode, we're speaking with transport planner Sarah Chapman, who's an associate at Markides Associates.
Alex, what were your key takeaways? I'm really excited to dive into this conversation because Sarah is fantastic.
It's really hard to separate transport from planning as a whole, but we kind of do separate them professionally speaking because we're town planners, planning consultants, and Sarah's specifically a transport consultant or a transport planner. The way we experience transport planning in a professional capacity as planning consultants is kind of through one project's contribution to a broader whole. But, as Sarah explains in the interview, there are parts of transport planning that need to be thought about at a more strategic level. Obviously there's things like regional transport, and that kind of infrastructure obviously needs to be thought at a very strategic level, which, as Sarah will explain, we don't necessarily yet have in this country.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And my kind of key takeaway is really similar in the sense that it's a transport planning thing, but it's also a planning thing, which is that there are these sort of macro things, like transport is about networks and connectivity, but it's managed on this site-by-site basis. And then in planning writ large, there's things like housing delivery, which are diffuse and sort of society-wide. But the intention is also to try to manage that on a case-by-case basis, on a site-by-site basis. So there's a lot of parallel there. All right, enough from us, right? Let's dive in. Make Planning Make Sense is presented by Centro Planning Consultancy as always. And as always, our email is podcast@centroplan.co.uk.
Let's jump in. Here's our conversation with Sarah Chapman.
Sarah Chapman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I think, it would be helpful if we could just start out with understanding what transport planning is and how it fits into the wider planning ecosystem.
I've been thinking about this and how you define transport planning, because I suppose that the short and quick and dirty answer is, well, we plan transport. But
such a cop-out.
I know, it's such a cop-out. Because, and I kind of hate that definition in many respects. So I think transport planning, if I was going to give it a sort of comprehensive and the most concise definition that I could, it's the planning, management, design, kind of all the way down to construction, overlapping with highways engineering, of all that's needed to move physical things and people from place to place on networks. It sort of covers a wide range of things. So we kind of interact with a huge number of disciplines. And I'd say in some respects, transport planning is a little bit the forgotten planning from a sort of more public perspective. Yet it's the discipline that develops everything that everybody uses. Everybody uses pavements, for example.
Yeah. It's funny you said it's sort of a forgotten element, when people think about the built environment. But, from the planning perspective, and we've worked together on applications, it's also very space intensive.
It is. And it's I'd say it overlaps a lot, like I said, with a lot of other disciplines. So, a lot of stuff doesn't get through without those considerations for transport and the input of sort of transport design. Even for, car-free developments or vehicle-free streets, you're still doing elements of transport planning to make them work effectively.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, can you just give us a little bit of a brief overview of the objectives of transport planning as a field, but then also the objectives of transport planning that we have nationally and locally in the UK?
Oh my gosh, big questions there.
That's a big ask.
Four big questions.
Right,
Yeah.
We'll just put a pin in that and then I'll just talk for the rest of the podcast because I think that's what I need to do to answer all
Would
that.
love to hear it.
So where is transport planning come from and where is it going to? So transport planning, I guess, has its roots back in sort of like the 60s when people started to become particularly aware that, traffic was growing, car ownership was growing, and our towns are, historic towns. They're not particularly well designed to handle that. So what do we do about that? And kind of out of various different sort of reports and studies, this sort of input of transport planning as a sort of almost unique and specific consideration separate from other types of planning kind of evolved. But it was very vehicle focused for a very long time. And I think it went through sort of rounds of being more or less vehicle focused. And I think, the hangovers of the late 60s, 70s, and then parts of the 90s where you had sort of those like urban sprawl and out of town sort of big retail parks, sort of that kind of planning really drove that. And then obviously we kind of hit a threshold with that. We were like, oh, hold on a minute, this isn't working.
Yeah.
and it sort of dialed back the other way. So I think when I came into transport planning sort of in the early 2000s, it was already making those shifts. So we were already being asked to consider some multimodal considerations. So as a minimum, not just cars, but thinking about sort of maybe bus users, things like that. And now it's sort of taken the next step to be really multimodal, because now we're starting to get policies within particularly city centres where you're not having any car parking. And now that's taken a step again. So the way that development in particular has been assessed to date has been very much this sort of predict and provide. So you had these sort of projections of massive background traffic growth that would always continue on an upward trajectory, sort of exponentially forever and ever, amen. And then you would have to try and provide lane after lane of carriageway width to accommodate that, bigger and bigger junctions, more and more signals, and more car parking. And we ran out of room. It's the shortened thing of it. We ran out of room, we ran out of money, and the implications of doing that became more and more obvious with things like, awful air quality. I think, it got to like the worst air quality since whenever. And so much after that, they started to sort of move away from it. Okay, let's not assume that kind of thing. But until incredibly recently, there's never been actually anything embodied in national policy to say, no, stop doing that and do something else. And that came in with the NPPF, which has now said you should take a quote-unquote vision-led approach. And that's saying, right, actually what we want to design is what we want to get to, and then we'll kind of work backwards from that and figure out how we're going to get there. So it's still quite robust, but I think the thing is we're now in this sort of transition period where we're trying to move to this new approach, but the definitions and the exact methodologies and the exact data you use to try and get there is still a little bit up in the air and open to interpretation. And it always will be, I think. But we're still pending that like nice big golden government document to land to tell us what their interpretation of the NPPF is.
So a vision-led approach is quite an interesting shift in our view, because transport planning is also a data-driven profession in a lot of ways. How do these data sets find themselves reconciled with a vision?
How you do that is still a little bit open to, individuals and officers and people to kind of determine. And I think there has been good data started to be released because people could kind of see this coming. It's not been necessarily a surprise. We've been moving in this direction for a while. So there has been these sort of collations of data, and there has been like new publications of data. But I suppose, to put it in sort of layman's terms, if we went back sort of 10 years and I was just doing a kind of bog standard residential development edge of town, let's say 50 units. You would go into a database, you'd find other housing sites, give them a bit of a check and see if the sort of the parking or the general parameters are sort of roughly similar. If you're going to be very basic, you just extract the vehicle trip rate from that, which is usually a ratio of surveyed vehicle movements per unit or per square meterage. And then you'd apply that to your 50 homes, and you'd say, right, it would generate 60 vehicles in a peak hour or something. But I'm going to assume, for my worst case assessment, to do all my junction capacity analysis, I'm going to assume that they're all commuter trips, and therefore that 60% car mode share gets slapped onto that, and suddenly I have thousands and hundreds of car journeys. And then we're dealing with, right, okay, so if we're assuming that, then we need to make sort of 4 more big roundabouts and a bypass. And that was the position for transport planning for quite a long time, and that was almost the desired approach for a very long time. But then what we found was we're just sort of building bypasses and road infrastructure at extortionate cost and increasing cost and increasing environmental cost for almost no reason. So it kind of goes both ways. You're sort of actually bringing down the assumptions about the level of vehicle use, which sort of also horrifies some people because they think, well, hold on a minute, that can't be true. Everyone's driving for everything all the time everywhere. Yeah. But on the other hand, you've got to be careful that you're not under-egging it either.
Yeah. So COVID was really funny.
It was a laugh a minute, wasn't it?
With regard to car parking surveys, like parking beat surveys. So these parking beat surveys during COVID would have to be done. And then when they were done,
you couldn't use the data.
Nobody would accept the data anyway. And it's like, well, we can use this, modeled sort of approach from before COVID. Well, no, that's not reliable either because it's COVID now. It's so different. And it's sort of like, everyone trying to figure out how to piece together like mode share data from historical data to a vision-led approach. How do you get onto the same page with a consultee who might have cobbled together a data set differently?
You get some real computer says no approaches. And sometimes you just have to be like, well, look, the 2021 data for commuting is completely useless. Usually in that situation where I'm getting a sort of, well, you can't do this, but you can't do that approach, I'll go away and find a third option and say, right, well, now you've got to choose.
Yeah.
Are we going to be silly? Are we going to be stupid? Are we going to be sensible? And I'm suggesting the third approach, which is a sensible one, which sort of looks at stuff in the round. And I think that's sort of been my approach to transport planning. And I think is an approach we increasingly need to take, that we need to actually look outside of our little silos and look at other forms of data. But that doesn't mean that where I'm sourcing that from is poor. I was looking at a self-storage unit, and there was a lot of debate about, well, how do we assess that? You know, it's in a particular location that's not a typical location, and it's not going to have, you know, a huge car park because it's going to just have a bit of van parking and blah, blah, blah. So I said, okay, yeah, no, those are fair questions. And I think we both agree that the TRICS database doesn't have good enough stuff in it for me to use. It's got one site and it's rubbish. So I rang up the sort of UK Self-Storage Association. I said, what do you know about this? And they said, oh, yeah, no, we do a report on that. So they sent me a report. Who uses self-storage for how long, what hours do they typically turn up, all kinds of data. Oh. So I wrote a little report, sort of pulling out what was useful out of that, and I sent it to the highway officer, and he went, yeah, okay, makes sense then.
Which is very proactive of you, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the sort of psychologist in me being like,
that's excellent, yeah.
But this is the thing, like, we are, as a nation, incredibly good at collecting loads of data. The data is probably out there somewhere. It's just not collated, or it's not repeated frequently enough. There used to be a thing that told you roughly how many people were employed per 100 square metres of, say, like office space versus light industrial, and that's been revoked. But that was quite useful.
I remember that, the employment density guide.
Yeah, it was
revision B.
Yeah.
It was quite handy because sometimes you did need to know that, but they decided to. It got really aged, so they sort of kicked it to the curb, but nothing has really replaced it, and it's
and it was probably super inaccurate when you actually go into case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
What I liked about it, though, is that it had data that then shaped the policy expectation, rather than having a policy expectation which is prove to me it's okay, and then you say how, and they say I'm not sure yet.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
I think it's maybe better in cases where it doesn't really break the bank if there's 20 more or fewer trips in that day, to say, look, this is going to be a model. It's not going to be perfect, but at least we have a sort of a consistency, and we're speaking the same language in decision making.
And I think that is in sort of the vision-led approach. So you are supposed to be aspirational. You're supposed to say, right, I'm going to design something that people will travel to by other modes than the private car, and they will be able to do that, and I'm going to have like this and this to enable that. But to get to that decision, you still have to go through the step of saying, like, well, hold on a minute, is that just pie in the sky, or is it actually feasible? And I think for a while, you know, pre even the MPPF change, when people were doing this, they were sort of it's a fluffy pie in the sky thing, and
that's the nature of a vision, though, right? Nobody wakes up from a dream and says, I saw a data set. You know, they say, I saw a vision.
Yeah, but you have to have a vision that's achievable.
Yes, absolutely.
So I think the starting point for any vision is asking, well, how does it function now? Where am I starting from, and where do I want to get to? And what the old thing was saying, well, here's where I'm starting from, and it's going to get worse ad infinitum, and therefore I've got to make an equal and oppositely extreme reaction to fix that problem. And actually, because both assumptions are so extreme, it becomes unfeasible and therefore unviable, and it doesn't happen. Or we have to throw lots and lots of money at it and build loads of infrastructure that actually is not needed.
Yeah, or vastly over-engineered, right?
We've gone massively over-engineered. We've gone 100% for something that really only needed a 30% solution.
Saint Jane, hear our prayer.
Yeah,
So the predict aspect of that predict and provide model has become more nuanced.
Yeah, it's become, I suppose the other buzz phrase has been decide and provide is the alternative phrase to vision-led. So it basically says, well, instead of saying, oh my God, how bad could it possibly be? You're saying, ooh, how nice a place do I want to create? Excuse me, another pun. What's my, like, road path to get there?
Uh-oh. This is spiraling now.
I know, can't help it. I love a pun.
The roadmap.
Yeah, what's the road? Yeah, not road path. I don't know where that came from. What's my road map to get to a nice place?
I love it.
You mentioned this really interesting thing. How nice do I want to make this place? And sometimes that can be because of transport, right? Connectivity and desire lines and cycle parking. And sometimes that can be sort of antithetical to making sure all of the transport modes have as much space as they would prefer in a public realm or on a frontage. How do you balance that in anticipation of an application being submitted? And then how do you field that through the consultation period?
It's really complicated. The thing with streets and roads and pavements and public realm is they're kind of egalitarian. Everybody can use them. And that means they are areas where you've got a whole range of conflicting needs and wants and aspirations and demands. And so the job is really to have a look at that and try and actually, on balance, decide which access needs are the priority, how do we design for those, and how do we make sure that we're not compromising sort of the really critical things. Human safety. Yeah. How do we make sure that, you're not designing something where you are putting people into conflict with vehicles? What's necessary? And that often comes into conflict with what people desire. And also, even amongst like those priority groups, if we're talking about accessibility for different vulnerable groups, sometimes they're in direct conflict with one another. Making things very bright and colourful and high contrast is really good for people with low visual acuity. But that's really stressful for people with, say, like dementia or autism. So it can be really complicated to try and resolve that. And then it's always a negotiation. It's a negotiation with the rest of the design team, with the other disciplines. It's a negotiation with the council officers, because you're never going to achieve a utopia. That's the downside.
Am I right to understand that different transport priorities are quite literally competing for space on a given development site, or is that too literal of an interpretation?
I think not even just different transport priorities, but also different priorities of disciplines. So, I've got to get maybe a big truck in to collect the bins, but that's not going to be very nice for your, a nice heritage conservation area. If I've got to put in double yellow lining, also something they absolutely hate because it makes your beautiful Victorian cobbles look really, really unattractive. Designing really nice places, you have to be the kind of person who likes the idea of untangling a plate of spaghetti and then retangling it in a way that is like algorithmically designed to get the most sauce with each bite. Like it's
That's
really
exactly how I eat spaghetti, actually. But I want to go back to this competition idea because every bit of space in the public realm in London feels negotiated on a very active basis.
It is. So I suppose on the one hand, it is very much shoot for the moon. Otherwise, you're never going to get there. But you're right, you'll have things like, existing on-street car parking. And I think on one hand, you do want to try and relieve that as a sort of placemaking thing. On the other hand, actually a little bit of pain in the system drives change as well. Like if it is a real difficulty to drive down it, people won't. So I suppose actually a sort of illustrative example of this was it the Hammersmith Bridge? When that got shut to traffic because it was falling down. They were sort of uproar and alarm. Oh no, what will happen? All these vehicle trips will fall onto local roads and
displacement
it'll be displacement and all of this. Businesses will fail because they won't be able to get their deliveries. You can still cycle across it. So actually, what they found was lots of things changed to cycling, and we find this across the system. Whenever there's roadworks, there's this real concern that all of that traffic is going to lump onto the immediate adjacent streets, and actually what you see is it either disappears entirely because people then decide, oh my god, I'm not going to be able to drive, I'll get on the bus, and things like that. And it is these sort of tensions between everybody wants it to be super convenient and we try and make it as convenient as we possibly can, but there's certain times you have to say like, you know what, convenience isn't the goal here. There's got to be some other priority because you can't have it all.
We will be right back. In transport in London, I think London does a good job overall. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's been, London policy is sort of unique in that it is really quite comprehensive and they produce a lot of their own data, which is really helpful. So there's a lot of knowledge base and there's a lot of expertise that really supports actually that kind of like weather change in the capital. And they're sort of willing to experiment as well.
Are there missing sort of ingredients?
I mean, there always are. There always are because things move so quickly. Things change so quickly. I mean...
What would one be, in your view?
Well, I think that, if we go back even sort of 5-6 years, the big innovation, or perhaps a bit further back actually, but sort of Santander cycle hubs or the cycle hire hubs, they were something that we were really looking to innovate. We had them in a city centre, we were looking to move them slightly further out, and then we were looking to see, can we get this going in regional towns? Can we get this going in other cities? And then what's happened is technology's changed, people's sort of desires of how they want to use bicycles has changed quite radically with things like, Lime bikes and stuff. Yeah. So that sort of changed the model, and it comes with its own pain points, but then the policies then chasing to keep up with these sort of changes in human behaviour, changes in technology. That's having other knock-on implications with things like residential cycle parking standards. So, those are always set based on evidence from a few years prior to whatever plan or standard is adopted. So it's sort of playing catch up. The cycle hire system is so prevalent now, and it's so sort of spread, particularly in urban areas, that people are saying, well, I don't need to own a bike because there's like 40 Lime bikes down the road. And so when I need a bicycle, I just go use one of those.
Yeah.
So cycle parking now is taking up lots of space in buildings, and particularly offices. So even more than residential, that actually possibly isn't going to be needed anymore. So what do we do with that space? It's taking up lots of ground floor space, it's taking up basement space, and it's expensive and it's not productive. So is there any other sort of flexible use we could use for that? In the next iteration of the London plan, I'm sort of expecting those to be reviewed to find out how actually it's relevant these days.
No, it's an interesting question because it is used.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of bikes with twisted rims that have collected dust and cobwebs, and they're kind of inherently vulnerable to theft. And even with like the nice magnetic locks and everything else, I've got one bike that I have to keep in my flat because if I lose it, I'm just going to be like, I can't like go through that headache of the insurance and stuff. And then I have another bike that I have down in the cycle parking communal space where I'm like, honestly, if it's stolen, they can have it.
I mean, I've got like multiple thoughts on this as directions I can go with an answer. So I suppose the first thing is that, cycle parking is only ever as good as it's designed to be if it's internal. So I've seen cycle parking designed, which is quote unquote not compliant with the ideal standard, but it's really well used because of how it's set up within the building, how it's accessed, how it's secured. With public cycle parking in particular, first of all, why are bicycles so expensive? Do they need to be that expensive? They are really expensive in this country because I used to live in Japan, and the cost of a bike there, like every bike shop, and there are hundreds of them, sells second-hand bikes, and they sell them really cheap. And they're really basic bikes. So I had a couple stolen, but on the whole, you almost didn't care because it was such a cheap bike. And it would sort of circle round again anyway. You go and pick up another, second-hand bike for 30 quid. And actually, to be fair, that's a lot of money for some people. But what I mean is, like, the cost of the bike was low, and also the sort of level of community policing is really high. But you know what I mean? The people fear the risk of theft, and they don't use the cycle parking in this country because A, they're buying quite expensive bikes, like you said, and that is that's a choice. That's a valid choice. But is that because, cheap bikes are harder to come by here, and there's not just hundreds of them that you can easily pick up?
Yeah.
And secondly, is it because the cycle theft and theft is on the rise because of the cost of bikes, and then you have this fear that actually nobody's going to do anything about it? You don't have an insurance claim. There's not going to be police following it up on it. So I think that sort of comes into this other systemic problem that sometimes I think we're trying to use infrastructure to solve issues that are ultimately social issues, or they're within other remits.
Yeah.
You can have the most beautiful street in the world, and I've been down some really nice roads in London doing sort of pedestrian audits and stuff. And they've got public art, they've got lovely tree planting, they've got nice flat pavements. They're ticking all the boxes for like healthy streets and all the desired sort of standard you would expect for like quote unquote safe places. But they're still hostile because there was still a betting shop where a bunch of drunk men were having quite a vicious punch up. So,
right.
And this is the thing. And it was like, hang on a minute, this is still like got nice active frontage. There's still lots of people around. It wasn't that late at night.
Yeah.
But there was this sense that actually this violence could kick off and that actually nobody was coming. So I think that's the problem we have. And I think, me wandering down there as a little transport planner auditor going, oh, well, if only there was a little bit more public art, or maybe if we had another CCTV camera, it's not enough.
Yeah.
And it's sort of deregulating some of these problems, I think, onto the wrong pair of shoulders.
There's that old adage, everything is planning, right? And on one hand, that's fantastic and true because the built environment and the environment more generally affects, like, there's a study, I forget, but it's like 80% of quality of life indicators. But not everything can be planning, right? So if that washes back and it's like planning needs to fix the systemic under delivery of road
mental
maintenance.
health services.
Mental health services.
You know, youth facilities, deprivation, all of these
I was just
things.
going to say road maintenance, but it is. It's so many different things.
It is a huge number of different things.
You know, biodiversity and net gain even is one of those things in planning where it's like, okay, well, we've absolutely flattened the ecology of this island. Green roofs?
Green roofs? Yeah. Yeah.
Deep tree planting pits. Like, you know, there's a lot of expectation trying to be built into what is also ultimately a site-by-site, reactionary, discretionary, speculative development paradigm.
I would agree with that. It can be incredibly piecemeal. And I think some of the issue with that is you get a lot of focus on areas that are already attractive to development and investment and regeneration. But that doesn't really resolve more of the wider network issues. You get very localized improvement. But unless somebody's actually really overseeing and planning for or actually taking an active interest in something at a slightly more wider level, then you're not going to get that level of improvement. And this is where I think there's a sort of like frustration amongst the general public. You know, you go to public consultation, they say, well, they're not building any schools, they're not building any medical centres. And, you know, nobody's got this overview of where's it going to get in this improvement from. And I think that those are the things that people really focus on. But in transport, it's like, well, hang on a minute, you know, you want us to improve active travel, but there isn't any sort of like broader plan for what you want, what the more network level desire lines. I know where people from this development want to go. They want to go to the station or they want to go to the shop. So my development can only provide a proportionate quantity of improvement. And then what do? You end up sometimes with planning applications where it's like, right, so you've asked me to design like, I don't know, 20 metres, half a kilometre of cycle lane. That's great. What's it connect to? Nobody's going to use it because it doesn't go anywhere. It goes straight onto an A road or it goes straight onto a whole series of residential roads where, you know, cycling's fine, but there's no real infrastructure. So I think that's sort of half the problem, that there actually isn't this sort of mechanism at a sort of more a master planning level to sort of join some of these dots, and where they're done well and where they've been done with a lot of sort of forward thinking, then it makes life a lot easier. And you actually do start to see sort of gear change in delivery of benefit.
How would that look in this sort of vision of a more coordinated master planned approach in a place that's previously developed? Because I can understand how it would happen in, you know, this urban extension that Vienna did a while back, or you know, or a harbour regeneration where you actually do have a boundary to an area and say, okay, there's going to be, so, you know, development corporations are an example, but
garden villages, sort of early doors tried to sort of apply some of that thinking. But you're right, you know, I think that's the thing. That's what I'm saying, where it gets kind of focused in these sort of almost really localized areas. And those are the areas that already potentially have benefit. It's the areas that are not attractive to development and change that kind of get left alone to sort of, you know, carry on rotting in some respects. Yeah. That's a horrible way to describe it, but they are, because if development is the only way you're going to get that change, and all of the upgrades have to be related and proportionate to development contribution to that development, then where development is not happening, where's that money coming from? Where's that funding? Where's that overview? If all the work is being done by the consultants or the private developer, then you're not going to generate that sort of equality of change. And then you'll get big gaps in the networks and it all starts to fall down a little bit. So
when you say it has to be proportionate to the development and directly related, and we're talking S01 E07 contributions, right?
And that's the sort of the regulatory process of how you can make those sort of legal agreements, which is fair, I think. You know,
and on paper, it has to meet those tests. The Reg 122 tests. But then in practice, there can be maybe a 30, 50 unit residential scheme. And however many vehicle trips in any mode per day in a given setting might not actually be noticeable, right? Or, but then the LPA says, this is our chance to put in that crossing that we wanted to do. And these 30 flats, it's the tipping point. We need a pelican crossing.
And I think that's the problem, because then it comes as a surprise and it ends up being an argument. It's like, well, why us? Yeah. Why this funding? Why this development? Whereas I think if you had sort of a more of a system at that at a sort of master planning level, then it's less of a surprise, because they've already come and said, right, we've audited the area. You don't need to waste time doing that. We know what we want. Everybody who develops in this area has to sort of pay their pound of flesh into that.
Yeah.
Do you think that the challenges of that discretionary planning system, where development comes forward one application at a time, and we also think about transport considerations, one application and one development at a time, which, if I understand you correctly, is kind of at odds with the more strategic approach that's needed for transport, which is inherently concerned with networks and not individual
I
plots.
follow.
Is it like an inherent problem, or is it,
Well, I think the thing is, the way you're describing, would it be great if we could do that at the sort of more strategic level? We do that, but we only do it for vehicles. We'll do it for vehicles, we'll do it for public transport, and the public transport operators and authorities have that kind of overview. And we have it for things like motorways and sort of strategic road network and sort of traffic modelling. And that will form part of local plan evidence bases as to, right, what do we need to resolve? So there they are joining the dots. I think where I'm saying it's missing is sort of the more multimodal stuff, and in particular the active travel stuff. There's sort of we don't have a national cycle model, for example. We're starting to get data. We are starting to get data, but we don't have that, and we don't know how many people cycle for different journey purposes at, I say, a granular local level, because that's, again, it's not in the census.
Like you were saying, a lot of new development for residential in London is car-free by design, by obligation.
Yeah.
And we've had schemes where the local authority will request a travel plan for those residents. And this is on varying sort of sizes of development, right? So we're not necessarily talking, Barking Riverside style schemes.
It has to be above 40 units, ideally.
I can confirm that this was under 40 units in an inner London borough, but
there's a little asterisk on that threshold that says, subject to the opinion of the officer.
Discretionary system. Yeah.
Speaking of travel plans, all right.
Oh yes, I had a point on travel plans.
Well, let's get to your point in a second.
Yeah.
My question on and maybe
this
will
please don't forget it again.
I think your point might actually be the answer to my question, which is basically
what's the point?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think, travel plans are a bit of an innovation of sort of like the late 90s into the 2000s. And they were really, really good for what they were, because nobody had a smartphone in their pocket to tell them how to get to A to B. So actually setting up a system whereby someone would have to pop up now and again and say, are you having any trouble getting to work by means other than a car? I've got lots of timetables I can then talk you through. And you'd have these things called travel surgeries, where basically you would book a room somewhere and you'd go and sit there, and people in the new development would come to you and you'd talk to them about their travel, or you'd go to the office that you'd built and you'd talk about that.
Does that still exist?
Sometimes they are still asked for. I think Briam still sometimes mentions things like this. But of course everyone's now got like Google in their pocket. So in that respect, they've sort of become a little bit meh. And in the past, they were very focused, obviously, on private vehicle mode share and how do we bring that down, and you had to set specific targets to do that. So going back to your question, Aaron, you were like, well, what's the point if you're a car-free development? I think what it becomes about is, yes, you're going to be a car-free development. Yes, there may be parking controls on street, or there may not be. So how are you going to manage and monitor things like car ownership? How are you going to monitor and manage things like the cycle parking? And that's where that mechanism actually does become quite useful. And to be honest, for car-free development, it becomes a bit of a bridge between people moving into a site and hooking them up with a car club. But basically, particularly in the vision-led approach, you said, well, we're going to achieve this, and we're going to do it by doing these steps, these mitigation steps. How do you evidence you've actually done that correctly?
Yeah.
That's what the travel plan does.
So accountability.
Yeah. So with the travel plan, you have to, before you occupy the site, you have to tell everybody, hey, there's a travel plan. Here's all the information about how to travel sustainably. Here's what we expect of you in, parking permits. Don't park on that road. And FYI, here's the coupon for the car club. Please use it. And then you go back a year later, or when the site is majority occupied, and you do another survey. and you find out, oh, okay, were we correct? Are most people travelling sustainably? Are they using loads of cars? If they're using loads of cars, why? Where are they parking them? Because we didn't give you any parking.
So the travel plan has this monitoring function.
Yeah.
Does it also have a sort of behavioral economics function?
It's a data collection process, really, that sort of is about that sort of monitoring process. I suppose it depends who's implementing it and how they're implementing it, because this is the problem with travel plans, because they tend to get devolved to various other parties. So let's say you have an applicant who's predominantly just a land promoter. So they're going to get the planning permission, and then they're going to pass that on to maybe an actual builder. So maybe a house builder comes in, they build the homes. They technically pick up the responsibility for the travel plan, and it may be a pre-occupation condition that they have to get this sort of detailed plan discharged with the local council. But there's very rarely anybody on the council side that then comes back in a year later to say, oh, so where's your travel plan update? So these things lag because people don't either realise they've got a responsibility for it, or they're not actually that strongly obligated to follow through on it, or there isn't actually any sort of single authority going around coordinating all of these. It's kind of a bit left to how good a plan somebody particularly wants. And I have seen some brilliant ones, and I've also seen some that have been a real waste.
I suppose the background of my question might be one of proportionality, because I'm coming at it from this planning perspective, and of course I'm representing the applicant as their agent, and so I want to keep costs down and keep determination periods shorter, and it might be helpful, I guess, to just sort of note that this inner London development where a travel plan was insisted upon was for 7 residential units, and it was in a place that does have car parking controlled by a CPZ.
Yeah, that's just a bit mad.
Which is so that's sort of where I was coming back to, which is like, why do we need to teach people to live in cities? That's kind of without cars. That's more our natural state.
Yeah, I feel like when it's such tiny scales like that, I mean, what are you going to do? Your percentage mode shares are like, oh, it's 20%. That's too high. Yeah, but it's 3 vehicles. It's three people. So you're right. There's it's
a
like
good
it's
intention.
It's the same as any tool. A fool can misuse it.
Damn.
I mean, do they still play that sort of function of what you said with the surgeries of kind of? I know we have Google Maps now. I mean, people can find every single mode of transport on their phone, but like, do they still play that function of telling people or kind of working with people to say, like, here are the different modes that make sense for you, and overcoming like certain barriers, because you can have the best design, you can have cycle store, cycle lanes, and for whatever reason people might still be reluctant to cycle.
Behavioral choice is definitely a part of how people travel and why, and I think it's a kind of underplayed part as well. So my academic background is in psychology, so this is very much within my wheelhouse. The role of the travel plan coordinator is actually a really important role. That's the difference. But you're right to say that, there are certain demographics who will be very shy of changing. But there's something to be said for amongst certain demographics and minorities that they're actually represented by, people. There's no point in some sort of suited transport planner helicoptering in from London to sort of tell, people in a more diverse community in sort of the Midlands say, cycling's really cool, because they'll be like, maybe for you, but not for me, kind of thing. Yeah. So it's also the sort of how much is this actually meeting that community on their level and actually understanding their concerns about why they're not doing things that we thought they would be doing or that data suggested they might be. Is it because actually amongst that community, cycling is seen as the poor man's choice? Because it's not got the same sort of social status amongst that group as, say, amongst like younger white males with their sort of expensive bicycles and sort of lycra gown clubs.
The bike I keep in my flat's not expensive. It's just expensive for me. But
it's just, what's expensive is proportionate to individual perspective, and that's fair. Actually also is there sort of language barriers, is there cultural barriers? People's lifestyles can have an influence on this. And I think, we do massively underestimate the vagaries of human choice.
I think that is a compelling case for a travel plan. And we're not actually debating whether travel plans should exist, right? Because they are an important feature of larger scale developments. And I really like what you were saying about having that community connection and that grassroots understanding of the community's needs and how those actually interrelate with things like mode share.
Yeah.
But TfL's ads all over its own bus stops are actually already giving them that same message, or where the CPZ is going to prevent them from getting a car parking permit anyway.
Yeah. Is there bloat? Absolutely. Yeah. So I've seen, I was asked to do a car parking management plan for 2 disabled bays. And I was like, it's self-regulating. Because if somebody parks there who doesn't have a blue badge, guess what? That's already illegal and it's on your road. So the car parking management plan is your own traffic warden walks along the road and sticks them with a penalty charge notice. Can I have the discharge of condition, please?
And you just have to think of that poor person whose job it would be to go over there every 6 months and go, they're there.
Yeah, there it is. And
then report that so it can be reviewed and confirmed by somebody else. And
let's face it, that report's never getting written.
Which isn't a good way to set up a regulatory system, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We don't want requirements to be expected with the comfort that there won't be follow through. I don't think that's a good approach at all.
And I think as well, like your travel plan for 7 houses in a car-free PTAL 6 location is also it's overkill.
6B.
Oh, 6B. Oh, my God. By the way, I would have probably gone back on that and been like, pourquoi? For what purpose?
And to be fair, we did,
okay.
Which is part of our value added as planning agents. Yeah. And we won the point.
Yeah.
But it's also then several weeks of delays and you have to go back and forth and kind of state the obvious to someone who is also at your professional level. And you just think, is this a good use of... Are we being proportional?
Yeah, when the active travel zone assessment came in, I don't know if all officers were particularly aware of how they should be applying that. Because one of the first ones I was asked to do, I'd followed the sort of the methodology as set out by TfL, and I'd gone to the training, so I was feeling quite confident on it. The officer came back and told me I'd done it wrong, and it had to be every road within a 20-minute cycle isochrone of the site. At which point I had to point out to him that was sort of probably a couple of 100 clicks of road space, and 3/4 of that was in somebody else's borough, at which point he did retract that statement, but I did have to go and point that out to him.
It sort of comes back to this thing about
conversation.
Someone at that master planning level.
Yeah. Some boroughs did used to have this. So a couple of boroughs used to have a sort of a cycle officer who was very much focused on, say, like, review of planning applications, the nuts and bolts of actual installation of cycle parking, and maybe the maintenance of it. And then they had somebody like a strategic cycle officer whose job was specifically to look at what is our network, how does that need improving. And you would have those sort of differentiations between, I'm sure you have it in planning as well. You have like a strategic planning officer and then like the planning officer, and they're sort of slightly more hierarchical. They're doing slightly different roles. But the idea is that, the strategic guy should have that oversight. But I think a lot of those roles have been lost in sort of various reshuffles, loss of funding, budget cuts. I do feel for local authorities because they are under the cosh, with an increasing, flood of planning applications heading their way like a big old tsunami.
But absent that regional sort of authority or the master planning level, I think it falls to the policy-making team.
It does, and I think some county councils have picked up on that. I do know of some county councils that do have county level or regional level, say, cycle strategies that sets out expectations for cycle improvement or active travel. They've got ones for buses, they've got ones for rail. Even more excitingly, there is one council that I know of that's got one for equestrians. Big thumbs up. I know, super special. We like that. Because they're usually a bit forgotten. But where was I going with this? I think, I got distracted.
Sorry, I'm just thinking about what authority is the equestrian plan?
I believe it's Hampshire.
Honey, of course it is.
Okay.
Not to put you on the spot here, but if you had to provide like 3 key takeaways to start to like
3
add all this up, you could do 3 or 2 or 4, however many you please, to be honest.
Oh my gosh. I think it comes back sort of circling around to what I said about this idea that development has to kind of solve all the problems to some extent. And to do that, therefore, we have to do all of this extra assessment, because otherwise, and I think the intention is correct. We need to understand things better, and we need to have reviewed things.
Yeah.
But the problem is, if you are requiring every development over a certain threshold to do an active travel zone assessment, and nobody is sort of coordinating the output of all of that work, then you end up in situations like the one I've had over the last sort of few years, where there is a particular long straight road that's got lots and lots of development sites on it, and the client that I've been working for owns several plots along there. And for each one of them, they had to do obviously a planning application and an active travel zone assessment. So for the 3 sites that I've been working on, they've had, over the last sort of 4 years, about as many active travel zone assessments as there have been applications.
Yeah.
So there was one memorable occasion, there was me walking down one side of the road taking photographs, and there was somebody on the other side of the road, and they were being a very good transport plan because they were wearing high-vis, so they stood out, also taking photographs. I bet she's doing an active travel zone assessment, and then she was measuring bits of the pavement outside another site, which I knew was also coming forward for planning. And so I thought, hang on a minute. So I know I've done this at least twice, 3 times, because I had to come back and do a night audit as well, because they brought in that, well, they hadn't actually published that policy, but they asked for it. So I went and did it. So I'm like, well, I know there's my 3 sites. There's 4 other sites. There's a really other big site, which is owned by the council coming forward. How many times has this poor road been subject to transport planners? And yet nobody at any point said, oh, we've got enough information, thank you, know exactly what we're doing. And this was an area where they actually had an improvement scheme already, which they didn't even tell us about, which I sent a pithy email in response to, being like, this was a bit of a surprise. You could have told me about this about a year ago. But to be fair, I'm not sure even they knew they had it. It was a bit of a disaster all around. But this is what I mean. Like it's that's the bloat in the system.
That's the bloat.
It's this repetitive, individualized approach to assessment, where actually, and again, this one stretch of road which already had an improvement scheme on it has now been surveyed umpty billion times, and other areas have probably been completely ignored because they weren't on the desire line for that particular set of buildings. I think it's a really difficult question, because there is no obvious solution, because like I said, a tool is a tool, and it depends on who's using it. I think in principle some of these things are good, but they're sort of the bloat comes from the misuse of them. It comes from this sort of uncoordinated, sort of nonsensical, we do process because we do process approach. And I think that's the bit that needs to stop. There needs to be somebody who says, well, like more of these strategic level officers, to be honest. I think let's give them back that resource, because they were really good, because you could go to them and say, hey, we're doing a development here. We're obviously going to speak to your planning officer. We're obviously going to speak to your highways officer. Anything we should be aware of? And they'll be like, yeah, there's this scheme coming forward, or we've actually got funding for that, but we're looking for this, or could you tie into that bit? And you'd be like, right, great, fine. I actually now understand the position and where the expectation sits. I understand the level of the work that's been done and is now expected, and I'm not repeating what next door has done. So I'm actually adding something of benefit rather than just doing work that's already been done, first of all, writing a report that nobody really wants to read and wasting somebody else's time on top of that, and then actually producing an outcome that it was already sort of effectively pre-programmed by somebody else, but they hadn't got planning permission, so therefore it became moot. And I think that's probably the bloat that could be trimmed out. I think actually understanding the problems we're trying to fix and what is causing them at a slightly higher level, or at a more nuanced level. I think, there's some real desire to see change in, say, things like street safety, and I utterly commend those, and I understand why people are pursuing them in the way that they're pursuing them, because the options to do it in perhaps more efficient ways have fallen by the wayside because of other sort of factors. And I think actually probably what we need to do is push back on that and say, yeah, look, we want to change this. We want to change this, but no amount of street lighting and CCTV is going to fix some of these problems, and it needs to stop being put onto our responsibility. Because at the end of the day, I think, particularly with that, I almost feel disingenuous. I'm saying, oh, well, I went along here and it felt a bit unsafe at night, so my recommendations are put in some CCTV and upgrade the lighting and boop, whatever. Isn't that just perceptual change? Is that actually making it materially safer, or is that just sort of generating false senses of security, ticking boxes and saying, well, we did something? And I agree, we need to do something. But
it's sort of saying we've done the thing that is in our remit to offer.
Yeah, it's fighting some sort of forest fires with buckets. And it's like, but hold on, we used to have a fire brigade for that. Where are they? And I think that's also where some of this bloat is coming from. And as I said, it's really understandable.
Treating symptoms.
Yeah. Like we used to have an ER, but now it's delegated to sort of
paracetamol vending machine.
Paracetamol vending machine, sponsored by Transport Planning. Yeah, that's where I see some of the bloat.
This has just been excellent food for thought and such a fun conversation. Thank you so much,
Sarah.
That's great. I've been really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Sarah Chapman, associate at Markides Associates.
That was our conversation with the legendary Sarah Chapman. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was excellent.
3 cheers, bear witness. Absolutely fantastic to talk to Sarah today. And we're also excited to plug a little bit of a reminder for our questions and answers episode, which is coming up as soon as we reach 150 followers on Spotify. No offense to anybody who listens on any of the other podcast services, but Spotify is far and away the largest sort of share of the market based on the data that we get to see. So we want to make it as easy as possible for you guys.
Send us your questions, because we do need questions for Q&A, to podcast@centroplan.co.uk. We really will answer them.
Which I think will be a lot of fun. And that's really it from us. So thank you so much again for listening. And until next time, I'm Aaron.
And I'm Alex.
See you next week. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please follow us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to get in touch, then we'd love to hear from you. Please write to us at podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Make Planning Make Sense is presented by Centro Planning Consultancy and recorded in beautiful London, England. Its executive producer is me, Aaron Zimmerman. Additional production by my colleague and co-host Alex Roth. Marketing and promotion by our colleague Reese Raymond. Graphic design by our colleague Mariam Malaxi. Music by Joseph McDade. From all of us here at Centro, thank you so much for listening.